So today's webinar then is about how to write a paper and how to get it published, and in particular, ultimately, how to write a really good paper. So how to go from sort of 85% there to 99% there in terms of writing something really good. So the first thing to get straight in your mind before you launch into this is, what's the story? Every paper tells a story, and you've got to figure out as you start to write it what that story is. So this is really the first thing to get clear in your mind, and then ultimately to discuss with your other co-authors, especially students and young researchers. If you're launching into this, as we hope you will, independently, at some early point, you want to make sure that your vision of the paper marries up with your main supervisors, in case they have a different vision of the paper, because there's no point in you wasting your time, so to speak, if somebody's going to strongly have a different idea as to what the paper should look like, or what the story is, or how it might be combined with other data, right? So as you consider your story, then what you've got to think about is what's new in your work. So the novelty in your work, that word novelty is going to come up a few times here. Why is it important, or what's the point? Or sometimes more bluntly, I ask, who cares about what it is that you're writing about? Very important that you understand that, so that you write to the right audience, so to speak. If you think your work is broadly important to every person on this planet, great. That means you've got really significant work. And you might, if you're going to publish this in a broad, high impact factor journal, you might therefore write it in such a way that it can be really understood by a very broad range of people, even beyond science. So why is it important, and to whom is it important, or what's the point? Next thing then is, what's the key data that makes that point? We're going to talk about how to structure a paper and understanding what's the key data, what are the key ideas and evidences in the paper that you need to get across, and what's, on the other hand, supplementary information that's important to have there and shows that you've done all the right things, but isn't necessarily a top flight or a top line piece of information that is critical to making your point. So it's sifting it into the necessary stuff and the absolutely important stuff. And then finally, what are the key outcomes that you're going to emphasize? And that relates back to, why is it important? So if you think you know those four points, if you've got those clear in your mind, the next thing to do is to write the abstract, a draft abstract. And we'll look at one of these in a minute. We'll look at how to write this in a minute. But the key point here is, if you struggle to write that abstract, if you can't write that short paragraph clearly along the lines I'm about to describe, then you probably haven't got your story straight, and then the paper is going to come out as a jumble of facts and figures. And so that's the wrong way to go about this. So remember, the abstract is kind of a test. If you think you can get a nice, clean, clear abstract written, go ahead and do that. And that's the item that you then share with, perhaps with your other main co-authors, your supervisor, etc., to find out if they've got the same vision. So it's a key sort of summary document that you can pass around your other co-authors. So let's assume we've got that story straight, and let's go on then to writing the abstract. So a good abstract has got a relatively clear-cut structure. You should try to follow this structure more or less. Sentence of context, in other words, that's the why is this important, what's it all about. A sentence stating the challenges that exist in that context. In other words, what is it that's is missing from this field, or what is it that needs to be done in this context to make progress? And that could be massive societal progress, or that could be scientific progress in some way, or experimental progress. The sentence stating the goals, in other words, the challenge, and then what's your goal in addressing that challenge? and then a few sentences of results. So very clear reporting, what I call the headline results. Be careful not to overclaim your results, but just put some numbers there or some key facts there, which are, as I say, the headline results. And then finally, one sentence summarizing some sort of overall outcome and where this might go next. So there are approximately 5 sentences. That's not a hard and fast rule, but the structure of those 5 points is something that's reasonably clear and common, and you should always look for it in an abstract that you think is well written, that you've read. Here's one to have a read through, and this is from a paper that I think we had in Nature Communications 2 or 3 years ago. No, it's not perfect. Probably today I would probably put a red pen through some of this, but what you'll see is a first sentence, which is clearly stating what it is that is, what's the context. This is the context about ammonia as one of the world's most produced chemicals and what it's used for. And then the second sentence sort of gives you the challenge, which is the fact that it's effectively a fossil fuel, or it uses fossil fuel. Every H in ammonia comes from H in methane or coal. So then the next sentence that we say, and it's often clear, that sentence is very clear when it starts with "in this work." That's a good phrase to use because it means there's no doubt about the fact that that's what this sentence is all about. So then we say what we're going to do. Then the next sentence, "in this optimized device," unoptimized device, we start to give some results. And again, these are the headline results. These are the ones that everything sort of leads up to. A couple of those. In fact, there's 3 of those effectively, 3 sentences of results. Although the sentence about sulfite is beginning to talk about the potentiality of where the actual work could be applied in the short term. And then the last sentence it gives you sort of a feeling for the future, a direction for the future. So that's, as I say, it's not a perfect abstract, but it gives you the idea of a structure of an abstract, and it's a good formula to follow in the outset, and then you can modify it later, or some of your co-authors might come along and modify it, but it's a good structure for you to follow in the first instance. So again, everybody, I can see the chat pane. So if anybody has questions as we work through this, I'm happy to, I'll see them, and I'm happy to try to answer this as we go, or save them till the end, but use the chat pane to send me a question. Okay, so let's assume that the abstract, then you've got that written, you're happy with it, and some of your co-authors are also happy with it. So we're sort of got a vision now that's a shared vision. Let's now then get started in drafting the paper. So the first thing to do is to start thinking about what's the journal we're going to send this to, and that's a discussion that comes up as soon as you write the abstract. You're giving yourself a feeling for the level, if you like, of the paper. So in assessing journals and where your paper might most comfortably fit, we need to think about relevance to the journal, right? Is this paper clearly within the umbrella, if you like, of the field of the journal? And if you're not sure, it's worth having a good, careful look at some of the online description of the journal. There's some journals have quite tight definitions of what they include and what they don't include. If you've ever, for example, wondered about JPhys Chem A versus B versus C, don't need to wonder. You can read all about it on the JPhys Chem website, and you get an idea of what's relevant to which journal. The exercise of writing your abstract will help you with the next point, which is assess the significance and novelty. How significant is it? In other words, does this matter? Is this something that everybody in the whole world, that everybody that you meet in the street would say, yeah, I understand kind of what you're trying to do there and why it's important? or is it just something that is more focused on your own scientific community in a certain area? Those are different levels of significance. So to whom is it significant, and how new is it in that context? If you've got a good feeling for those, then you can start to choose between the high impact journals and the not so high impact journals. So the higher the broad significance and the greater the novelty, then the higher the impact journal that you can think of going to. So we'll come back to that, but getting into the journal, which means getting past or getting selected effectively by the editor that you submit to, comes back to significance and novelty. So it's best to have a very clear idea of the significance and novelty of your work at all stages. Okay, so let's assume then that we've got a journal in mind. It's a very good idea in terms of style, not only to get hold of the pro forma document for that journal, but also to actually find a paper. Probably best to be a paper that's not directly in your own field. I'll tell you why that is in a couple of slides. But some other paper that stylistically, in terms of the way it looks and other details of how it's laid out, that you can follow. How long is the introduction? How many references do they have? What are the section breaks that they use, and how do they format those? How big are the figures, and so on, so that you don't have to make decisions on all of that yourself, and most importantly, so you don't start doing things in the wrong style, which then has to be fixed later, right? So it's very good to have a clean idea of what the journal style is going to look like. All right, we're on our way now. So then you need to understand what materials are going to go into this paper. So the writing out a table of contents. Now, I mean deeper than introduction, experimental results, and discussion. Introduction might have several sections to it in your mind, but most importantly, in the results section, it's important to have an idea of how you're going to present the key results. So in other words, next dot point there, which tables and figures are the key ones to have, and what's their order? Remember, we've got to have an idea of the key data that makes the argument or makes the story, in order to present them in the simplest possible way. And anything extra can go into supplementary. So supplementary is not designed to be read from start to finish, but your paper needs to be read from start to finish. So you can be quite ruthless in getting stuff into supplementary, so that your main presentation is the key data that needs to be understood by the reader. Now that's part of your table of contents. Sometimes that table of contents literally just becomes a list of tables with their figure captions and table captions. Is a good way to sort of, without ever writing out the figure or without actually presenting the graph, of deciding for yourself and for your co-authors what is going to be in that figure. So write out the caption at this stage, and that way you're clear on what it is you're about to do. Another key point at this stage is thinking about a title. The title can change many times during the drafting of a paper, but the title at this point can make sure that you're crystallizing, if you like, the key points of the paper and keeping it clear, so that ultimately what you write addresses the title, and the title describes what you've written. So that's a circular process. And I've got a few slides here that I borrowed from an overall presentation that I put together with several colleagues from ChemCom editorial group. So this is one of their slides that comments on titles, and one of their slides later on will come back to this, how important this is from their point of view. They say it should be clear, obviously, descriptive, but not overhyped, right? Nothing worse in terms of being as a referee than titles that really feel overhyped, and then in the end, when you read the article, you decide that they are overhyped, and it just you end up with a rather bad opinion of the paper. a thing we often forget is it needs to be discoverable. Your work is, your publication is of no great value unless people can find it. And therefore, if you can use words that are clearly the sort of words that people are going to search for, can everybody mute their mics, please? We're getting some noise in from somebody's mic. Still there. Okay. Right. I think maybe we're okay. So here's an example then of a paper. This is to do with some coating materials, and you can see some examples there of what the editors thought were or was a good title, as opposed to a number of alternatives that are quite reasonable given the content of the paper that really aren't. And if you go through them, maybe from the bottom, the one at the bottom is clearly not descriptive enough. It says what the field of the paper is, but it doesn't really say what the paper is going to actually tell you about in that field. The second one from the bottom is way too detailed and certainly not that long, at least not for this kind of journal, that long chemical name, which is unintelligible to most readers, at least at this level. So that's way too detailed. Now that may not be true in some more focused journals, like organic chemistry or something like that, but certainly not for ChemCom. This is all about ChemCom, this particular slide. And the one at the top doesn't quite tell you what it's about. So there's a little too much detail about how it's prepared as opposed to what you achieve. Okay, we're getting a question here. Let me just see. Somebody asked, sorry, can everybody mute their mics? There's somebody that's got a mic that's not muted. And we're getting a lot of scratching noises. Right, so let me just try to answer this question. So somebody says, quick question on discoverable titles. How do you deal with the problem of Americanized spelling of words, for instance, fiber and fiber? Probably not going to have an entirely independent approach to that. Many journals will correct that spelling to suit their stylistic guidelines. In other words, are they UK based or American based or equivalent? And I would actually think that many search algorithms, in fact, would cope with that. Now, I could be wrong there, but there isn't really much more you can do about it. Then you can't. So you're more or less going to have to do whatever the journal requires. Tony says, to comment from Tony, she says, good practice for racist members to write these couple of sentences of results in their monthly reports. So that's a good idea. In other words, you can be effectively preparing some of your key points that will, in various ways, be useful as you start to write these papers. You can be writing these points into your monthly reports as you go. Okay, so a bit of careful thinking about the title at this stage. Again, this is a good way to keep yourself focused on what is the key point. What's the story? The story should be evident from the title, from the get-go. Okay, then we can dive into writing the sections of the paper. It's not necessary to do them in the order that I'm going to describe them, but on the other hand, it's sort of certainly logical to work through them this way. But it's okay to leave the intro till later if you feel that you want to get onto the experimental first. So the intro, in some ways, is a very much expanded version of the abstract. We have to understand the context, and each of these dot points is a paragraph or a sentence or two in a paragraph. The context is usually the first paragraph. Just to be clear to anybody who's completely outside the field, what it is that that this work is all about. Why is it important to focus on this work? Again, the sentence or two or more stating the challenges of the field. So this is expanding on that part of the abstract. And then once that challenge is stated, then a clear and comprehensive review of the published literature. So there's often a question here of how far do you go? How much literature do you review? And this is a very big question that a little bit depends on the journal, and that's why it's good to have an example or two from the journal that you're aiming for in hand, that you can sort of ask, well, how many references are typical in this journal? So what's the expectation? In other words, JFIS Chem is a good example, or many of the ACS journals, often 50, 60, 70 references, totally normal. So if you can only produce 20 references, you better be very clear in your mind as to why that is true. It better be an area where there really isn't much background literature to review. So lots and lots and lots is what I've said there. In other words, don't hold back on that, and it's better to ultimately get some of your co-authors to cut some references or suggest that some references be deleted if you've ended up with too many, or it can be appropriate to effectively, what should we say, combine a whole lot of references into a single one, which is a review, if there's an appropriate review that you can find that you think covers broadly the point. That's an okay thing to do if you don't need to individually reference a whole lot of papers. Very important to finish off the introduction with a few sentences or a paragraph which are stating very clearly the goals of your work, so that there's no question what it is, as the reader reads on into the rest of the paper, what it is that you are trying to achieve. Again, this is where you need to have the story clear in your mind as you write this bit. And often, to make sure that the reader doesn't miss a key point, it doesn't do any harm to have a sentence stating the headline results. Again, this is a little bit like what's in the abstract, but it doesn't do any harm to repeat it as long as it's not a direct. Don't just copy and paste the words, but if you can put it a different way, perhaps a slightly expanded wording than is in the abstract, then that's okay. Right. Any more questions? No, not so far. Let's go on to the results and discussion. I've skipped experimental. Experimental should hopefully be straightforward, and you should simply follow the style of the literature of the journal, I should say, in understanding how to write that experimental. And it's also very common for expanded experimental details to appear in the supplementary. Results and discussion. So step through the data point by point. This should already have been, you should already have figured this out before you got to this point of writing. You should know what your order of presentation is. It's usually tables and figures and so on. These are the key things that structure your results and discussion. So step through point by point, comparing to literature information or drawing on literature information as you go, because that's really part of results. And carefully noting control and reference experiments that you've done in order to confirm your conclusions, or to confirm that the data is genuinely indicating what you think it's indicating. So don't skip over those. Make sure that you mention them right up front here as you discuss the results. Discuss the implications. This is now getting into discussion. To make sure you structure that in a logical and clear fashion, make it one paragraph per point. A point might, so state what the point is, state some of the evidence and discussion around it, and sort of briefly indicate the conclusion to that point. And ultimately, later you might combine several paragraphs, but it's a very good practice to break it up into paragraphs to start with, and then see how it looks as you read it, as you proofread it. Again, comparing with the existing literature, there is no greater failure in writing a paper. So how to write a not great paper is to not properly compare it and key it into the existing literature. So referees who really know the field will probably stop reading at this point if you haven't done this, and simply say this is not an adequate piece of science reporting if you haven't done a good job of keying into the literature. Supplementary information. There's a stylistic almost revolution going on, and has gone on in the literature in the, let's say, the last, say, 5 or more years, in terms of writing a paper. So you need to be aware of this as you look at the literature. Are you looking at something that's written in, say, in the last 3 or 4 years, or was it written 10 years ago before supplementary became a major component? The distinction is in the style of the paper. I think papers are now getting to somewhat more brief, with much more supplementary material presented in the supplementary information, and the expectations of what might appear there are increasing all the time. So it's not uncommon for routine mass spec and infrared spectra to be shown there, and supplementary information documents that are 100 pages long are not uncommon. So there's no problem with that. The style then is changing from what you might call a beginning at the beginning and end at the end style of writing, that is typical of a novel or any other sort of essay that you might read. Is changing from that's the older style, to more of a web page style, where the main page is the overview, and then embedded in that are links, either literally links or just references to the other document, to direct the reader to that other material should they be interested in looking at it. So that's a different style of writing. So it's a hierarchical style of writing, which I think it's a good development, because it makes it easier to read the main paper. But you need to be aware of that as you look at both old and new literature, and clearly keying yourself into that newer style, so that you're ready to push stuff off into supplementary, but well referenced there, if it's not absolutely critical to the overall flow of your logic, so that the reader doesn't get lost in your logic. Okay. Moving on. Yep.
Sorry for interrupting you, but we are dialing from the meeting room and we cannot write through the text thing. But I have a short question. So the paper has like a really strict structure, but in the supplementary info, is there any structure that you have to follow as well there, or you just organize it the way you want?
Good question. You are able to organize that fairly much any way you want, but if it gets substantial, I believe that a table of contents is at the front of the supplementary is a good idea, and you can actually link the table of contents to the section heading, so to speak, so that it's very easy for somebody to find the information they're looking for. If that makes sense. So certainly structure it. Don't just sort of put a whole list of figures and tables. Certainly, give it some headings, or give it some structure that is easy to find your way through. Almost like a list of individual web page elements might be structured. But generally speaking, journals don't have any particular rules and regulations around that. Okay. Any other questions before we press on? All right, good. Finishing it off. So obviously you're going to be, some pages, stage here, you're going to be circulating this to all the authors. It's important to check the authorship with all authors. So the important point here is that it's the responsibility of everybody involved to be clear and comfortable with the authorship. Is anybody missing? So, senior researcher, you may be unaware of important introductory conversations and planning meetings and so on that went on earlier than even your involvement in the overall project. So your senior people may have input to that, and you've got every reason as a junior person to understand what it is. So it's the responsibility of all authors to understand the role and confirm and comment if somebody's missing, right? Don't ever be shy about pointing out that somebody may have contributed something significant. Okay, the key word we use here is a significant intellectual contribution. And if you think that's the case for somebody that's not on the list, you should say so. Proofread it very carefully. Proofreading is I think is a skill that needs developing in a lot of people. You have to learn yourself how to not skim your own work. It gets very easy to, because you wrote it, you can you almost know what's there, so you stop reading it carefully. So somehow or other you have to find a way of not doing that and teaching yourself how to actually read it word by word, so that you know that that you've caught any mistakes. Pay attention to a spell checker. Pay attention to any of the grammar underlinings. So if you can't understand why something is blue underlined, maybe you talk to somebody else and see, but certainly don't ignore those and don't turn those tools off. Use this as a way of learning more about English structure. Check the references and style. I have a colleague recently who bailed an honors student up in an honors panel because the references were rather untidily laid out, as in, you know, some of the author names are missing and there are obviously mistakes in the EndNote file and so on. And this particular senior professor took a very dim view of that, said if your references can't be right, then how can I trust any other part of your work? Interesting comment. So it's an easy thing to get right. Don't let it be wrong. So it's important to flick through the references one by one. It's part of proofreading, and make sure that the information is correct and it looks right. Make a check PDF. There have been numerous, some infamous stories of documents going forward for submission with various comments still embedded and track changes maybe still showing. So make a check PDF to make sure before you submit it that it is all laid out correctly and that nothing has gone weirdly wrong as a PDF has been generated. It's amazing how things can go wrong just at that stage. Let's go on to an issue that is always around, but is becoming more and more to the fore because it's becoming more and more easy to pick it up. And many of the journals now are doing so, and the outcome is not good. So, plagiarism. What you must never do is never use a sentence or more without placing it in quotes. Now, even a full sentence should be placed in quotes if it's an exact replica of what you've got from the literature and referenced. So tell a little story while you're all absorbing that. I was reviewing a paper over the Christmas break for a very high-flying journal. Maybe I better not say which one, but one or two journals that most of you would love to have yourself published in at some point or other. I was reviewing this, and as I was reading through the supplementary information, at one point I sort of read a sentence, and I stopped and I thought, I wrote that. I just knew that I'd written that sentence because it was written in a rather short, abrupt way that I thought very few people would ever write something quite the way I did that one. And sure enough, I went back and to the paper that I was thinking of, and I was right, one of our papers. Then I discovered that it wasn't just that sentence. It was a whole paragraph of experimental of description, but that doesn't matter. It's still, it was broadly detailed enough that it should never have been plagiarized like that. But the worst aspect of it was that it wasn't referenced. So our whole experimental approach, which took one of our ACE's crew probably 6 months to get right, wasn't even referenced. Okay, so the outcome of that story was that the journal because I insisted on hearing what the journal was going to do about it. The journal, of course, rejected the paper. The journal approached the senior editor, the senior author, with a warning and seeking an explanation, which I'm sure was blaming some poor student who had sort of done it and then forgotten to references, is probably what had happened. And but with a warning to the senior person that the journal would approach the university senior management if an adequate explanation and plan for the future wasn't forthcoming. So this is serious stuff, and people lose jobs over this sort of thing. So stay well clear of this. Be aware that taking a sentence and changing one or two words isn't really adequate, and there's a real danger, especially if you're not, well, even if you are a native English speaker, but if you're not a native English speaker, there's a real danger here that you can change a couple of words and then somebody else will come along, maybe one of your senior authors who is a native English speaker and goes, I don't really like the way that's quite written now, and changes the wording right back to the way it was, unconsciously changing it back because it's changing it back to something that reads a little better. Okay, so then plagiarism has been reintroduced, shall we say, by accident. So just don't do that. How do you not do it? The answer is to never have a paper, somebody else's paper, sort of open and visible and around you as you're writing. So in other words, if you deal with hard copies, don't have it sitting on your desk. If you're dealing with PDFs on your computer, close them, right? And then write your section from memory. Never ever have it open so you can glance at it. How did so and so put it? And then your eyes go back to your keyboard and you start typing. That's a way to accidentally plagiarize stuff. So make sure you just don't have anything that you can look at and easily absorb as you're writing your stuff. Is a good way to try to avoid this. Most journals are starting to check. But you shouldn't, what should we say? You shouldn't rely on that as a way to kind of sort it out, because it produces a black mark against all of the authors, and too many black marks with any given journal or any given publishing house like ACS or RSC. Too many black marks, and you'll just find that your papers just don't get accepted anymore, just don't get out for review anymore. So it's a bad situation to get yourself into. And the point is, the worst aspect of plagiarism is when you don't reference, because it looks like it's intentional. All right, a couple more slides then. Turning ordinary writing into great writing. So here's some quick points then as to how to take your originally written article and really improve it. So there's an improving stage that goes on here. Try to keep the English simple. Most of the people who read your paper will actually not be native English speakers, so don't make it complicated. Keep the sentences short. The longer a sentence, the more likely it is to kind of contain a grammar or a logical mistake in it. Try to make your logic very clear so that the sentences kind of connect with one another in any given paragraph. So words like hence and therefore are word equivalents of a mathematical logical chain, and I think are useful to use, but don't overdo them. Look out for ambiguous sentences. In other words, things where what you're actually saying isn't completely clear. Maybe it refers to something, the word it, it or they can be unclear because you don't know exactly who or what they is. So you have to try to make sure your sentences don't become unclear because they're ambiguous. Avoid repetition, obviously, and especially of chemical names. It's very hard to read big sentences full of long chemical names and then pick out the words that you actually want to read from within it. So either just avoiding repeating the name unnecessarily or using some sort of abbreviation that is easy to just read over. And I reckon short is good. Cut unnecessary words and sentences in proofreading stages. I would say on average, when I'm looking at a raw draft from one of my younger coworkers, I can usually cut them by about a third. so that shows you how many often unnecessary words and sentences are often around. Proofreading, check tenses and articles. be aware of the differences between your language, and especially in regard to tenses and articles. Try to learn, if you've seen somebody correcting your English, why it is it's gotten corrected, and then try to learn what it is that is the problem is. And often the problem is that your language maybe doesn't have certain items, shall we say, or structures, so that you're just not familiar with it. And the best way to get over that is just to learn about it. So one of the famous ones is articles. Words like the and they and and so on are meaningful in English. And if you leave them out, it becomes very ambiguous to an English reader. And knowing when to put them in and which ones to put in becomes a little bit of an English skill. So best to learn about that if that's not your native language. And another trick is to put the manuscript away for a while and then proof it again. Oh, okay, a couple more slides here I'd slotted in. Here's a couple of slides coming from our ChemCom editorial group. So these are the people in the office or the handling editors as opposed to the reviewers. Here's the questions that they ask when looking at your article and deciding whether to send it out. And many of the journals that most of you would like to get published in are sending out maybe only 20 or 25% of what is submitted to them. So you've already got a major cull going on that you don't want to be part of right at this point, as you all probably know. So they ask, is it scientifically correct and robust? Is it ethically sound? This is where any history of plagiarism is already in front of these people as they look. So the record of the authors is clear and evident to them. Is there any other ethical issue that might crop up? Right up front in the letter and the abstract, that's probably all they're going to look at. Is it communicated clearly? If it's not, they're probably going to send it back to you and ask for it to be sort of rewritten some way. So you've got to get it clear, and the abstract is the first place that the associate editor looks. Can the editor understand the new insight that genuinely adds to the existing literature? Is that clear in the abstract and the cover letter? If it's not, then they're probably going to reject it. And for some journals like ChemCom, the higher journals, then that broad interest beyond a narrow focused field is something that they're looking for. So that cover letter then becomes important. It's got to be clear to the associate editor at this stage that this is something worth looking further into. So all these points that should be in your abstract might get expanded on and written in a little bit more of fulsome language than maybe is in the abstract. So what is a paragraph of an abstract can become a page in the cover letter. And then finally, let's have a bit of a discussion about all of that. So I think those slides will all be part of this presentation that will be recorded online, I think. So you can go back and have a look at some of those if you like. But let's turn this over to questions now. Don't seem to have any currently. Okay, not seeing any at the moment.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yep.
What's the difference between short communication and a full paper? How we can understand we can publish a short communication rather than a full paper?
Okay, there's two distinct answers to that. What you might call the slightly older-fashioned answer to it is related to, this is before the days of supplementary information, where the short communication was a means of publishing a paper, usually quite quickly, which contained a small amount of rather important and interesting data. And there was usually an expectation that what was called a full paper would come along later and be published in a sister journal of some sort. So that was sort of the ChemCom formula as of 10 years and more ago. Now, more recently, communications are being used in, I would say, in the style of so this is the second point, a short paper or a briefly written paper with a lot of supplementary information, so that if there's a key point that can be put across in the sort of 3 or 4 pages of a communication journal, if that is true, that in say 3 or 4 figures and associated text, that you can really make your point and write a good readable paper like that, it's a good way to go. So that's what you might call a short but nonetheless very important paper, with loads of supplementary where all the extra information is. So effectively, those 2 kinds of approaches then. So those are no longer really, well, they're communications, but they're not really written as a preliminary paper anymore. They're written as a full paper, but split up in the way that I've just described. Now, is that sort of answering your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Hi, Guy. Just a quick question. What about the conclusion part? You know that some journals ask for writing just conclusion part. Should we follow a certain structure, or we just need to pinpoint the outcomes from the research? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I don't think a conclusion needs to have any particular structure. And some people call it a summary and conclusion. How much of a summary you need depends a little bit on how much, shall we say, broad individual detail has come out of the work, shall we say, right? So if in some single point short papers, the summary is almost not necessary because the whole discussion is about that main point, and you've made your point. Nonetheless, the summary and conclusion is a good way to start. So the first part of the summary and conclusion is just to state a couple of sentences pointing out the key outcomes of the work. And then conclusion is maybe more broad about what that all means in the context of the challenges and the goals of the original work, and often finished off with a comment about what's next. Most journals are okay with a sentence that begins, our future work will include, if you're prepared to write that sentence, or this work suggests new directions, and blah, 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 blah. So you're giving some ideas as to where this might all go next. So those are good concluding sentences, but no journal usually produces requires a structure to that. I'm seeing.
Hi, Doug. I have one
Yep.
question. So sometimes we see there are results part and discussion part separately.
Yes. Yes.
So when to stop and how to save the further discussion to write in the discussion section.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good question. There are multiple approaches to this, and there's no really right or wrong answer. So you just have to try to do what you think makes most sense in your story, shall we say. Some really old-fashioned editors, and there aren't terribly many of those around anymore, who have got the rather strict sort of logical science idea, which is that results must be presented before any discussion or conclusions are reached. If you see that kind of evidence and then conclusions, logical approach, right? However, some discussion, if you like, of the results needs to be done usually in line with the presentation of those, comparing it to the literature, discussing it against controls, all of that information that sums up a piece of information that's being presented needs to be there with it. So discussion then becomes usually the last part of the document, where it kind of is all brought together and put together into the final meal. If you think about each section of the results as being the vegetables and the rice and the meat and whatever else is in your meal, these are the component parts. So you've got to get them right, but then you finally put it together so that the reader can see how it all fits together and finally supports some hypothesis or produces some overall outcome is the final section. That's the discussion. So that's the way to look at it. Look for that final summary, concluding discussion, and that's where your discussion emphasis should go.
So basically, in the results part will be the point by point, maybe description, and then discussion. I have to make the story. Is that
That's
what
right.
you are suggesting?
That's right. Yes. Put most of what you might call comparison to the literature and so on. Put all of that with the results. And then the discussion section is really about bringing a whole lot of different points together in a discussion of what it all means. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Somebody else wanting to? All right. Somebody on chat has said, sometimes plagiarism tools evaluate papers incorrectly. Yes, indeed. For example, reference list is considered copy material if it reflects on the originality score. How to overcome this? Yeah, we've all seen this with the likes of Turnitin. The journals are using a different, I think it's called Crossref, bit of software that they all contribute to, at least the big journal houses do. And they're quite careful to, so they don't just look at a score, they're quite careful to look at what you might call significant bits of plagiarism, not just the odd sentence, not the odd bit of an odd sentence here or there. So, but the score will alert them to the need to delve further. But the editor will look quite carefully at the situation before anything is said or done. Somebody says, is it possible to send as the PowerPoint? Sure. Or maybe it can be put up on one of the ACES file repositories. So I'll talk to Tony and Lauren about that. All right, good time to start wrapping up here, I think. Didn't mean to take a whole hour, but that's okay. Any final questions or comments? Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. I have a second webinar style, workshop style thing in mind, which is more a practical editing and of blocks of text. So in other words, actually working together online to see how to improve blocks of text. So you can see what I would do with some paragraphs where I reckon I could cut maybe a few sentences out of worth of material. Otherwise, okay, we'll call it a day at that point, and maybe see you all online again sometime soon. Bye.